So we're going to address mean blood pressure and the factors that affect your mean arterial pressure or blood pressure. So I have this diagram and I want to go over a few things that are important here. So maintaining your blood pressure. So to maintain blood pressure, which is mean arterial pressure, requires coordination of heart and blood vessels, and believe it or not, the kidneys. So, kidney, which is shown here, regulates one of the three main factors influencing blood pressure. So there's three factors that will influence blood pressure. And this is long-term and short-term. And so they have to do with the heart, blood vessels, and kidneys. And so those three things are kidneys deal with blood volume. How much volume is in the system affects how much pressure is in the system. The next is cardiac output. And so that's number 2. And cardiac output is the product of heart rate times stroke volume. So those two things factor in as well. And the third thing is going to be total peripheral resistance, which is otherwise known as just resistance in the arterioles. Right, so resistance. So those three things contribute to blood pressure. And so I'm going to explain each one as briefly, but specifically as possible. So let's start with blood volume, right? This is the kidney. So kidneys regulate blood volume by deciding how much fluid you keep in your body or get rid of. And this is done hormonally in the long term. So you have a couple of hormones. You have antidiuretic hormone, which will keep water in body, and that will increase blood volume, right? So ADH. You have renin, and we'll talk about this when we talk about the kidneys that get converted to angiotensin 1 and then 2, and that stimulates aldosterone to reabsorb sodium, and water follows sodium, right? So water is going to follow sodium. Both of those things are going to increase blood volume, right? So if you increase blood volume, that ultimately gives you more volume of blood and can lead to more venous return. And remember, more venous return means you have a higher end diastolic volume, and that's where Starling's law may come into play, right? If you have a higher volume, it's going to stretch the myocardium to optimal overlap and can lead to a higher stroke volume. Higher stroke volume then means ultimately you can get a higher cardiac output. I'm going to put that in pink. So that's number 2. Okay, so blood volume is influenced by the kidneys long term, and that's hormonally controlled. Other factors that are going to influence venous return, you see this arrow coming in like this, that's skeletal muscle pump, and that's from muscular activity to return blood to heart. So that helps, right? If you have More muscles pumping and squishing the veins, you're going to have an increase in venous return back to the heart, and that would lead to a higher end diastolic volume. So that happens a lot when you're exercising. That's one way that we get a better venous return when we're exercising versus just standing in one place. Other things that affect blood volume, excessive sweating, or if you're bleeding out, right? Those things. So hemorrhage blood, right? Both those things are going to ultimately affect blood volume, which is, so like here, those will affect blood volume. So that's blood volume. Now looking at cardiac output. So blood volume can affect cardiac output because of stroke volume, but other things that factor in to that would be our central nervous system, right? So you have baroreceptors and chemoreceptors that are monitoring basically blood pH. For chemoreceptors, partial pressure of oxygen and partial pressure of CO2. And if these go up or down, chemoreceptors are going to respond and are going to activate either parasympathetic or sympathetic, the autonomic nervous system, to increase, which is parasympathetic, or I'm sorry, decrease is parasympathetic. Decrease, and in case of sympathetic, it's going to increase the heart rate, right? So you have vasomotor that are going to control blood arterial diameter, and you have cardiac centers that control heart rate. So I'll just do heart rate. Heart rate, and so that is here. So baroreceptors are checking for blood volume and blood pressure, and they respond accordingly too, because these vasocenters and cardiac centers affect both the heart rate and the diameter of the blood vessel. And so they can constrict or dilate depending on if they want the pressure to go up or down. They can increase heart rate. If you increase heart rate, you can increase cardiac output, right? Or decrease, you can decrease cardiac output. This can also affect stroke volume in that if you have a lower heart rate, right, it gives more time to fill. Ventricle, and that could result in a higher stroke volume. So that's how that's tied in there. Exercise, what things influence this? Well, if you're exercising, right, or if you have some kind of trauma or stress, right, activates your sympathetic nervous system, body temperature, any kind of stressors. And the final thing, so the final thing is going to be total peripheral resistance, and I'm doing this in red, so TPR, called a total peripheral resistance, and that is really basically almost exclusively due to the diameter of blood vessels, right? And more specifically, the arterioles are the ones that really determine it. Yeah, blood viscosity can change the total peripheral resistance if you get really viscous because you're dehydrated, but you'd have to be pretty extremely dehydrated or hemorrhagic, right? So you lost a lot of fluid, or you have a high hematocrit. I can't spell it. Let's try that again. So high hematocrit, anything that will increase the thickness of your blood, blood doping, that kind of thing. And then blood vessel length can affect it, but really once you're done growing, you don't increase the length. So these two generally don't factor into controlling mean arterial pressure. But what are the things that control the diameter of the blood vessel? Well, hormones. So epinephrine, norepinephrine, those are neurotransmitters, but they're also hormones from the adrenal medulla. And those are sympathetic nervous system activators. They will constrict the blood vessels, right? So epinephrine, norepinephrine will decrease the diameter and increase the resistance. So those decrease diameter and increase resistance. Other factors, so angiotensin 2, that leads to aldosterone, and ADH, both of those will constrict blood vessels as well, right? So aldosterone, they both will increase resistance by decreasing the diameter, vasoconstriction. As well as these vasomotor centers, parasympathetic will relax, increase the diameter, and decrease resistance is parasympathetic. And sympathetic, of course, will decrease diameter and increase resistance. So the vasomotor centers will also affect total peripheral resistance. And those things combined are going to affect your mean arterial pressure, which is stroke volume times heart rate times total peripheral resistance.